And joining us now to discuss the heavy security measures is a former FBI and now Executive Director of Safety and Security for RAIN, otherwise known as Risk Assessment Network and Exchange, is Brian Lynch, live in Philadelphia. Brian, thanks for being here. This level of security for an inauguration is unprecedented. As my colleague Sophia Kai just pointed out, it's like a war zone. But after the deadly siege on the U.S. Capitol earlier this month, is this amount of security, in your opinion, appropriate?
It certainly is. If you look at what happened on January 6th, there's certainly a case to be made that this security is right on point. And it's really driven by intelligence and past action. So absolutely.
One thing I've been thinking a lot about is when I see these images from my colleagues in Washington, is that the threat of extremists doesn't go away after January 20th. In your experience or in your role, do you expect this heavily fortified presence to be this sort of new normal in Washington as the U.S. fights extremism on its home turf?
Well, it can be, maybe not to the extent that we're seeing for tomorrow's event, but there's certainly going to be amped up tension throughout the next short-term 6 months or so. And then, as you mentioned, there's going to be some of this threat going forward. And it really depends on the results of outreach and investigations into these groups and the ability of the new administration to reach out as well to lessen the tension.
What do you mean by that, reach out?
Well, I think, we've got to be able to talk to all groups and make sure that they're part of of America. But we're looking at criminal activity, what happened on January 6th. I'm speaking of reducing the tension around certain issues. And, law enforcement is going to do their level best to reduce this through investigations and their own outreach. But I think it needs to be a national effort.
Brian, you referenced intelligence ahead of tomorrow. What exactly is that intelligence detailing?
Well, you mentioned about a week ago they began this. I think this started probably many months ago. And the intelligence is really the ability to understand the intent and capability of those folks that may show up, about what they may do. And then you plan around that, and you plan for the worst and you hope for the best. But planning and a visible presence is certainly a deterrence.
I'm wondering about how the U.S. moves on from this. In your estimation, do you think that domestic terrorism and risk from these extremist groups outweighs risk from foes abroad right now?
Well, it's hard for me to say. I think you've got a risk of domestic terrorism, no question. That's been around for decades. It's heightened within the last 6 months, and as you mentioned before, it's probably never going to go away. But the collective efforts of law enforcement on this front, particularly those that are looking to conduct some sort of act or criminal activity, is paramount to controlling the situation.
How does the United States root out domestic terrorism, root out extremism? You mentioned reaching out and communicating with these groups, but what's the long-term strategy for de-escalating this situation?
Well, from the perspective of law enforcement, it's exactly what they're doing, which is identifying the groups that are that have the most impact or could have the most impact, and then determining whether they're actually in the act or the planning of committing a criminal activity. And then after that, it's ensuring that there's some communication between the groups about their intent and capability. And that intelligence is critical to addressing what that group's objective is. And if that objective is of criminal nature or of a terrorism nature, then all of the tools available to law enforcement should go and be applied towards that group.
We saw reports yesterday that the FBI is vetting National Guard troops in Washington, D.C. over fears of an insider attack. We've seen the arrests of several members of law enforcement in the wake of the January 6th attack on the Capitol. how does this get rooted out from the inside?
Well, first of all, that's good practice. It's not that difficult to do. And what you're looking for is any connection to past cases or current investigations. So that's good practice. And they're looking at what is the holdings of the FBI. Do any of these names touch on any of those investigations? So that's really the first step of gathering that intelligence and ensuring that they didn't miss anything prior to the event. But going forward, it's a collaborative effort between law enforcement, the National Guard, and in all of the state, local, and federal agencies to ensure that there's proper identification of the groups that could pose the most harm. And then again, using all the tools in the toolbox to address those groups. And frankly, if they're looking to commit criminal activities, to prevent that from happening.
Executive Director of Safety and Security for RAIN, Brian Lynch. Brian, thanks so much for your time and for joining us on Quicktake this morning. We appreciate it.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quicktake now for insight in an instant.